Perfect. Okay.
All right. Cool. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending my virtual presentation today. I'm sorry that we can't do this in person, but this is the next best thing. I'm David Gluckman, and I'm an immigration attorney and a director of the Immigration Practice Group at the law firm of McCandlish Holton. I am presently located in Richmond, Virginia, but I am actually a native of Fairfield, Connecticut. I grew up there and I graduated from high school there, and my father is an MBA grad from Sacred Heart. So has a special place in my heart. I do want to make clear, though, before we proceed, that even though we're recording this, everything I'm telling you is as of November 19th, 2020. Unless you guys have been hiding under a rock, you know that there has been an election and there likely is going to be a change in administration. And we are hopeful that some positive changes will usher in come January. So some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today may become quickly outdated. I hope it is, actually. But in the meantime, just be aware of that. And thank you so much for listening. And let's get into this. So we'll start with the 30,000-foot view of immigration law in the United States. So you've got two main buckets. The first bucket is the bucket everyone wants to dip into, permanent resident green cards. And why not? Green cards are absolutely awesome. You can use them to live forever in the United States. You can work for whatever employer you want to work for, or you can choose not to work at all. You can travel back and forth without having to deal with consular officers and visa stamping. It is really wonderful. And you're thinking, okay, I just want to do that. But look at that last bullet. That's the problem, is there are only but so many ways to obtain a green card. And often, especially depending on whether you guys are born in China or India, it can involve very lengthy processing. So what does that do? That brings you down to the second bucket, those temporary non-immigrant visas. Those are what keep you living and working in the United States while that green card process is going on in the background. Now, we have lots of different categories of visas. They go from A all the way through V. They've got things like the S visa for snitches who are helping to take down the next drug kingpin. There's the Q3 visa for people who are participating in the Irish peace process that concluded 30 years ago. So I'm not going to bore you with those. I mean, they're easy. If you're ever trying to fall asleep, take a look at them. I guarantee before you get to the letter D, you'll probably be asleep. So I'm only going to talk about the ones that are relevant to you because very few of them allow employment. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the F1 visa and optional practical training, and then the H-1B, which is the most common work visa. We'll also touch on some alternatives to the H-1B that might keep you here and working in the United States, or that might be more appropriate to you given some of your unique backgrounds. So without further ado, let's talk about that typical post-graduation employment path. So you're here on F1 status. What's going to happen after graduation is you're going to apply for and receive something called optional practical training. And we'll be talking about that next. That's going to give you a 12 to up to 36 months of employment authorization after graduation. So up to 3 years, that's a long time. Or if you're presently in J1 status, you'll have something very similar called academic training. That will take you 18 or 36 months of work authorization. And then typically you will transition from optional practical training if you're an F1 or from academic training if you're J1 to the H-1B visa, which is the most common work visa, gives 6 years of work eligibility, and seems to be in the news pretty much every single day. And we'll spend a great deal of time discussing that to make sure you understand how to get one of those. But first, let's talk about optional practical training. Next to your degree itself, and I don't think I'm overstating this, the most important part of F1 status is optional practical training. It is a huge, huge benefit. And you're probably thinking, yeah, sure, I want to bank some coin. I want to work. I want to make some money. And sure, that's part of it. And everybody wants to make money. But the most important part of OPT, optional practical training, is building relationships. And why is that? Well, for optional practical training, we'll talk about some of the logistics in a second. You can pretty much do everything by yourself. You pay for it yourself. You apply for it yourself. So you show up on day one with an employer, ready to work. They don't have to do anything. So you get in there, you strut your stuff. They train you, they invest in you, and they like you. And then guess what? Because you will have built that relationship, they may want to sponsor you for further visa categories and permanent residence where they actually are the ones who are in charge and not you. So it's really important to get optional practical training to build those relationships. And you're probably thinking, well, I don't even have a job offer, so it's not even worth my applying. And the answer to that is you don't have to have a job to apply for OPT. In fact, you can't start working until you get a work card in the mail for OPT. What happens is you will apply and you'll get the card. And then once the card is issued, you have 90 days to find a job. And it's a job that is related to your field of study. It might not even have to be a paying job. And who makes the call about whether the job is appropriate for OPT? It's going to be your International Student Advisor, so at Pam's office. So they're going to walk through everything about OPT and make sure that you actually get the application completed correctly and filed on time with the right fee. And it's $410. It sounds like a lot of money, but trust me, once you see the H-1B fees in a couple slides, it's going to look like an absolute bargain. And it is. I mean, $410 for a year of employment authorization where you can make some money and build relationships is a very small price to pay. Now, for you folks who've been here long enough, you know that our government is very slow. So do you want to wait until the last minute to apply for OPT? No, you want to try to apply as early as you can. And what's the earliest you can apply is up to 90 days before your graduation date. So if you're a December grad, you haven't applied yet for OPT, make an appointment with Pam's office now. All right, it's very important that you get that. Now, in terms of the 90 days of unemployment, there is actually even greater flexibility now due to COVID. They are allowing even as little as 1 hour a week. If you're working in a job that's related to your field of study, that is actually going to stop that unemployment clock from running. So it's very relaxed now, understanding the economic crisis that we're going through. And if you're at day 80, day 85, and you don't have a job yet, then guess what? You can actually contact your academic advisor at school, see if there's a volunteer research project in your field of study, and just doing that for even an hour a week, normally it's 20 hours a week, will be enough to stop that unemployment clock from ticking. So really, it's easy to plan for. You don't have to have a job offer to apply for OPT, but it is an extremely important benefit because it allows you to get out there, strut your stuff, and build relationships with employers who will later want to sponsor you for future visas and permanent residence. Now, for folks who are lucky enough to be studying in a STEM major, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics major, then you have an even greater bonus of 24 months of additional optional practical training for a 36-month or 3-year total. I mean, that's pretty amazing. For another $410, you get another 2 years of work authorization. So how do I know if I am eligible for a STEM extension? Well, like many things in academia and in your academic life, Google is your friend. So just Google Department of Homeland Security STEM degrees, and you'll come up with a PDF that lists every single major that qualifies for a STEM extension. Next to each major, there's a numerical code called a CIP code, CIP code. If that code on the PDF matches the code that is next to your major on your I-20 form, then voila, you qualify for a STEM extension. And the I-20 form is the form that you use to apply for visas and to re-enter the US from foreign travel. So it's pretty easy to determine whether or not you're eligible for a STEM extension. And I want to pause for a second to talk about the fact that you have 36 months of work authorization. Folks, I'm going to talk about the H-1B and green card process in a little bit, but if you're from a non-backlogged country, meaning that you're not from China, India, or sometimes the Philippines, oftentimes 36 months, if you have a gung-ho employer, is enough time for you to complete the entire permanent residence process, or to at least get far enough into the process where you can get your own work authorization based on the green card. So it is extremely valuable to have this STEM extension and to have those 3 years to play around with in terms of getting your house in order and getting ready for the green card process. Now, I'll do there's a couple of differences with the STEM extension as compared to the first year of OPT. So the first thing is there is no grace period for you to apply for STEM extension. Your application has to be received by immigration before your first year card expires. And guess what? There's no forgiving that. Every day, it seems like I get an email from a student that says, I missed the deadline by 1 day. It's so unfair. Can I do anything? And my answer is, I wish it was different, is unfortunately no. The regulations make the deadlines very clear. And if you're depending on this particular administration to be forgiving of somebody missing a deadline, then you're going to be barking up the wrong tree. It's really unfortunate, but it really is important for everybody to understand. Number two, unlike the first OPT, where you can just submit that application by yourself, you actually, for the STEM extension, you have to come up with a training plan with your employer. And it's not an easy matter. It's nothing that you can do in 10 minutes. You actually have to come up with various phases, milestones, how the case is going to be, how your training is going to be supervised. You got to get that signed by the employer, and you got to get it turned into Pam's office to get that authorization for STEM OPT. The reason I'm telling you this is don't wait till the day before your card expires to get around to this. Don't wait until, wait until maybe there's a month left on your card at the most, and then do that. Make sure that you have that paperwork done and turned in time to get the paperwork for the STEM extension so that it's received before your card expires. Again, no forgiveness if you miss that deadline. And another thing is that unlike the first OPT, you actually do have to have a job lined up for STEM OPT. And it's got to be a job that not only is related to your field of study, of course, but it's got to be with an employer that's enrolled in a program called E-Verify. E-Verify is a nationwide web-based employment verification system that's run by the Department of Homeland Security. You may find that it's not a problem at all because many employers, especially in states where E-Verify is required, are going to be enrolled. If you're interested in anything that touches on federal contracting, those employers are all going to be enrolled in E-Verify because it's required as a condition of contracting with the federal government. But the good news is that if you ask HR and they say they're not enrolled in E-Verify, well, they can actually enroll even if it's just for the purpose of hiring you, and the enrollment process is relatively simple and straightforward. So STEM OPT, amazing benefit, 2 additional years, $410. Pam's office will help you with that. Don't miss out on that opportunity because if you miss out on it, it's gone forever. So don't miss out. Before I move on to the H-1B, I wanted to pause to see if there were any questions on OPT that have come in yet, Patty.
I have a question. With the OPT visa, are you allowed to travel outside the country?
That is a very good question. And that is a question that is going to really depend on the individual circumstances of your case.
Okay.
I'm going to need to talk to Pam's office about that because there are a number of things involved. Number 1, do you have a valid visa? Number 2, have you only applied for OPT and you're waiting for an answer? Number 3, have you applied for it, gotten an approval, but don't have the card? Number 4, has the card been issued, but you haven't received it? Number 5, have you tried any other green card process? Number 6, has the H-1B petition been filed yet? So it's a lot of different considerations in mind, which is why you'll see on that previous slide on the bottom bullet, I've given up on giving generalities on this because it is a case-by-case basis. So make sure that you consult with Pam and her office before you make any decisions to travel, especially these days when there's the added restrictions of these COVID travel bans. If you're from Brazil, for example, and you're coming back from there, 14 days, if you've been in Brazil, you can't come back unless you get a waiver. So there are all kinds of considerations right now with international travel, and it goes beyond OPT. I would just say anytime you're planning international travel, it's really good idea to check with your international student advisor and maybe even to talk to an attorney about it because it's just gotten so complicated these days with COVID.
I have a question too, if you don't mind. If these students who are in the room and who are also on OPT are planning to apply for the STEM OPT, you've mentioned that the employer must be enrolled in E-Verify. As they look for those jobs in OPT, can they access the E-Verify database to check before they apply for the position whether the employer is listed there or not?
Yes, you can. There is actually, if you Google, again, Google is your friend here. There is a database where you can just search by employer to see who's enrolled in E-Verify, and it should come up.
Perfect, thank you.
Great question, but that is actually a really good resource for people to check. All right, let's get into the really fun stuff, H-1Bs. So, you know, you hear about it every day. It seems like and it's only negative. That's the thing. It's always negative news stories. But what people don't understand is the H-1B is what is bringing some of the best and the brightest minds to America. And it's contributed to countless companies that have been founded, countless opportunities that we would never have if it weren't for foreign workers coming here on the H-1B visa. So don't believe all that bad stuff that you hear in the media. And I'll talk about that in a second because there's easy ways to address it. But the H-1B visa is a core bedrock part of our employment-based green card and immigration system. And it's not going away anytime soon. It is the most common work visa. And let's do a little compare and contrast with F1 OPT. So remember, one of the benefits of F1 and OPT and even STEM OPT for the most part is you're going to be doing everything. The employer is going to do very little. Sure, they have to help you with the training plan for STEM OPT, but you pay, you apply, you do everything, you're ready to work. Here for the H-1B, the employer is going to be the one who's driving the boat. So they are the ones who are sponsoring you. They are the ones who are filing the paperwork. So remember, that is why you need to build those relationships. Because if you don't build a relationship with an employer, then it's going to be less likely that they're going to be willing to stick their neck out and sponsor you. So make sure that you use your OPT time wisely for that. So what are they sponsoring you for? They are sponsoring you for a job that requires a degree in a specific field of study. You must, of course, have that specific degree, and the degree's got to relate to the job. So really, if it's a job that doesn't require a degree, or doesn't require a specific degree, it's going to be almost impossible to get an approval. So just know that up front. Now look at that last bullet point. There is no need to advertise for US workers. That is the #1 reason I think employers say they don't want to do H-1B, but guess what? It's not even a requirement. That is a type of green card process that requires them to advertise. But if they want to hire you on H-1B from OPT, there is absolutely no precondition that they have to show that there are no other US workers. If they want to hire you, they can hire you. No problem with that at all. All right, so it's important for them to understand that up front. Now let's get into the H-1B issue. So we'll get a little bit more detail here. So duration. So they file an H-1B petition for you. It can be approved for 3 years initially, and a 3-year extension after that, 6-year maximum. It can be extended in certain circumstances that are related to a green card process. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about green cards. Scope of H-1B authorization. Oh, happy day. I just got approved for H-1B. I've already downed a couple magnums of champagne, and now I'm only thinking, well, what does it actually mean? What does this approval notice actually allow me to do? Well, it's actually surprisingly narrow. It only allows you to work for that particular employer doing what was described as your job in the petition in the location that was described in the petition. It does not allow you to moonlight Uber driving. It does not allow you to bag groceries in your spare time. It does not allow you to write the great American novel in your spare time and market that. No, it only allows you to work for the particular employer that sponsored you doing what they told you they were going to do. Now, if there are going to be changes, like let's say you move from the Bridgeport office to the San Francisco office, they're going to need you to file an amended petition because they want to make sure, because the H-1B, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, requires you to be paid at least the prevailing wage in the geographic area for the particular job category where you're going to be working. So obviously the wages in San Francisco are going to be higher than the wages in Bridgeport. Government's going to make sure that that's being done. So anytime there's a major change, the employer is going to need to file an amended petition. Now, for folks who haven't taken history class yet, you understand, you might not know this, but Americans don't believe in indentured servitude. So once you have an approved H-1B, you are not obligated in perpetuity to remain with that employer. You are free to change to a different employer. The only catch is that that new employer is going to need to file a petition to transfer your H-1B to them from the old employer. What's good about it is that if you currently hold H-1B status and they transfer that, and the new employer files that petition, then you can start working for them as soon as that new petition is filed. You don't have to wait the very many months it may take to get an answer from the government and to get an approval. It's a huge benefit because it allows for job mobility, because in reality, who's going to be waiting for a job for 6 months? Nobody. So it really is an important benefit. Now, also, you're thinking, well, what if I get another job offer and I want to take up that job in addition to the one I've already got? What if I've got a part-time H-1B? And yes, hint, that is available. You don't have to have full-time H-1B. You can have it for part-time. What if you want to have 2 part-time jobs? That is totally allowed. It's just that each job has to be covered by its independent H-1B petition. So if I wanted to work as a professor during the year and then in the summer I wanted to work as a consultant, then I can have 2 concurrent H-1B approvals for those filed by those 2 employers, and I'm perfectly eligible to do that. All right, so it's kind of flexible, but at the same time, it's kind of rigid because every time you make a change, you have to make a filing. But it's workable, and it's certainly better than the alternative, which is to not have any H-1B or any visa status at all. And it's, again, these are all to get you through to hopefully getting the green card, which allows you the flexibility to do whatever you want. So we have to understand the rules so that we can get to that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Now, for my sticker shock slide, H-1B issues on cost. All right, so remember, $410 for 2 years of OPT, $410 for the first year of OPT. Bargain. Look at the H-1B rates and you'll see why. So the first question is, who pays these fees? Well, unlike OPT, where you can pay everything yourself, federal law requires all these fees related to the H-1B process to be paid by the employer. So they're not allowed to pass that on to you in any way. You cannot offer, say, hey, I'll reimburse you for these costs. No, that is not allowable. They have to pay all these fees, which, there are numerous. So let's go through them one by one. So the first is a legal fee. If they're using an attorney to prepare the petition, they got to pay the attorney's fees. And I strongly recommend anybody who has an employer interested in doing the H-1B to use an attorney, given the number of pitfalls and traps that this particular administration has set to try to make it very difficult to get an approval. And then in addition to that, they have to pay the USCIS filing fees. So these are the government filing fees that they need to pay regardless whether they use an attorney. So You've got the H-1B registration fee. That was a new fee this year of $10, and I'll talk about what that is in a second. $10, that's not bad. Base fee of $460. Okay, it's still doable. Not too bad. Oh God, fraud prevention fee, $500, because we're all committing fraud here, and if we pay $500, we are making sure that it's a legitimate petition. Okay, now I'm starting to sweat a little bit. Oh God, trading fee, $1,500. So I'm on top of that. So we're almost up to $2,500 here. So that's $1,500 for employers that have more than 25 employees, $750 for smaller employers. And then there's an optional premium processing fee. So if you actually want the government to process your petition in a reasonable time frame, so for 15 days, they've just jacked up this fee to $2,500. Again, it's optional, but a lot of times it becomes required when you need an answer on the petition. So, and then there's this last bullet that talks about an additional $4,000 fee. Don't worry about that. That's only for employers who have most of their workforce in either H-1B or L status. So, they're going to know very well about the H-1B process because it's part of their whole business model. So that's really going to be a problem. So you're probably thinking, oh my God, I might as well just log out right now. This is not going to be an option for me. There's no way an employer is going to ever shoulder this burden for me. And the answer that I give is don't, because it's all about OPT and building those relationships. And I'll just tell you from my own personal perspective as an employer, right? I have people that I have trained over 1 year, or especially if they've been with me for 3 years, they know how I like things. They understand how my system works. They understand what where my filings go and how they're done. That is invaluable training. And if I have somebody that I like, and they already understand how I want my stuff done, then why would I, in my right mind, lay that person off and try to find somebody who's even half as good as you, and then spend that additional time training them from scratch? It doesn't make financial sense. So for many employers, it's worth paying this price so they can keep your institutional knowledge, your training in-house, so that you keep working for them because they already like you. So why would they want to get rid of you and hope that they find somebody that they might like even half as much? All right, so that's just the reality of it. The second is that this is for 3 years. So you can really kind of divide this by 3 and understand that it's really not that big of a financial outlay if you expense it over a 3-year period. And it's also tax deductible. Last time I checked, employers like to pay lower taxes, not more. And then final is, if you are working for an employer that has a recruitment budget, as many employers do, then they'll just take this money out of their recruiting budget, because why would they need to spend money recruiting when they've already found the ideal candidate in you? So it really is not that big of a deal at the end of the day. And I'll talk about the H-1B quota in a second, because if they have more H-1B registrations than there are quota numbers available, there's a lottery. Well, spoiler alert, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, there's been a lottery for the last 9 years in a row because there are so many more employers that are filing for this than there are numbers available. So there is considerable demand for these H-1B visas, even though the costs are so high. So really, it all goes back to building up your reputation with the employer, building those relationships, and then it really, from an employer's perspective, it is almost a no-brainer for them to want to just continue on by paying this so they don't have to hire somebody else to train them from scratch. So really, it's not that big of a deal, even though it seems really daunting when you first come up with it. Now, this next slide I put in a couple of years ago because people were really getting depressed at the rhetoric they were hearing from the president, the negative headlines they're seeing all the time. They're like, oh my gosh, why am I even bothering? This H-1B is going away, or it's impossible. But that's not the case. So it's harder now, no doubt, but it's definitely not hopeless. It just requires you to pay more attention and have the right help preparing this petition than it ever did before. So the first thing is, H-1B is a stable program. So everybody's thinking, oh, it's going to go away. No, it can't go away. It's created by statutes, which Congress needs to actually go in there and repeal. No chance of that happening. And also regulations, which require an extensive regulatory process, which the government's been trying to do, but they rarely do it correctly. There are frequently lawsuits to stop them, as there are right now, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So it's not something where the president can wake up in his bathrobe one morning and be like, no more H-1B. No, he can't do that. So what are they doing out of frustration is the administration is focusing on applying the existing law more harshly. You got to make sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed. You got to make sure that you're not falling into any of their traps. And that's why the importance of having experienced help in preparing these petitions is more important than ever before. So what are some of the issues that they're focusing on? The first thing is the specialty occupation concept. So in order to qualify for H-1B, you have to be sponsored for a position that qualifies as a specialty occupation. What the heck is that? Well, it's a job that requires a degree in a specific field. Okay, so it can't be a job that is accepts multiple unrelated degrees. So if you're in a job search and you see this job posting that says, we'll accept a degree in chemistry, theater, criminal justice, gender studies. No, that is likely not going to qualify because it's all about the body of specific knowledge that is required to perform that particular job. So that's a hint on the job search front. But in terms of people who are still in school and have time to further specialize, the greater specialization in your curriculum, the better. So if you have just a regular old MBA, that's going to be a hard case because it's going to be perceived by immigration as a generalized degree, not a specific specialty area. But if you're in an MBA with a specific concentration in finance or in marketing or international finance, then that's going to be a lot more helpful for getting you through this specialty occupation concern. Because at the end of the day, I kid you not, sometimes in these petitions, you have to actually line up specific courses that you've taken and relate them to specific duties of the job. You do need to go into that type of granular detail. And obviously, the more specialized you are in your degree program and the more specialized a position and the ability to link that special knowledge to specific courses is going to make it a lot better for you to get your H-1B petition approved. So that's something to think about. And off-site work. So I mentioned that because it's a very common phenomenon for recent grads. So off-site work is, the way it works is that staffing companies around the country, they have clients, and these clients have temporary IT projects, and this is really most common in the IT field, is they have these clients that have temporary IT projects that they just can't staff with their own employees, so they use employees of the staffing company to come to the work site and help with those particular projects. And it's totally doable in H-1B. It just requires pretty much you to kill a few rainforests worth of paper to get these petitions approved. So that's a great example of it's harder, but it's not hopeless. You just have to have an attorney help you who understands the types of documents they're going to require for those petitions so that we can know that we have them up front to satisfy them rather than just file and see what happens and then they issue a request for evidence and then you can't provide the required documents. Then even if you've been selected in the lottery and your case has been receded, if you get a denial because you didn't have the right documents, then you're no better off than when you started. So really, it's harder, not hopeless. Just make sure you're with somebody who understands the rules of the game and the evolving interpretations of this particular administration. All right. Before I get to the actual calendars and the H-1B quota process, are there any questions that I can answer about general H-1Bs?
I just want to share that Sacred Heart had, we had 123 students get sponsored for H1 in 2019 and 65 so far for 2020.
Great. Those are good numbers.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pam. And Pam also answered a question in our group chat as well. So
Okay.
yeah, and may I say you do an exceptional imitation of our president.
Oh yeah, well, I'll have to work on another imitation pretty soon. So, yeah.
Anyways, please continue.
All right, so let's talk about the really fun stuff. I'm sure everyone's waiting for it. Calendars, yeah. So everybody on this Zoom call is your starts on January 1st and ends on December 31st, and you're thinking, okay, well that's pretty straightforward. I can understand a calendar. Well, guess what? That makes far too much sense for the U.S. government. No, instead they have something called a fiscal year. And their fiscal year starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th. And you're probably thinking, well, why the heck do I care about what the government calls its year? And the answer is you need to care because every fiscal year, a new quota of H-1Bs is released. And that's an 85,000 quota of new H-1B visas. So this does not count the people who already have H-1B, who are extending or changing their H-1B. It's people like you who just graduated, have OPT, and now you're ascending to H-1B status. So that's 85,000 available across the board. Now let's dive into that. So what makes up that 85,000? So you've got a special set aside of 20,000 that is just for people who've graduated from U.S. institutions with master's or higher degrees. So if you're graduating from Sacred Heart with an MBA, that's a special set aside for you. If you have a PhD, anything higher than a bachelor's degree, you get a special set aside of 20,000. And then there's 65,000 for everybody else. So people who have bachelor's degrees only from Sacred Heart, bachelor's, PhDs, or master's degrees from outside the US. So they're gonna have 65,000. So the way it works is this. So every single year since 2012, there have been far more registrations or petitions filed than 85,000 numbers available. So there's been a random lottery. So the way the lottery has worked in the last couple of years, they reversed it to try to make it more valuable to have that U.S. higher degree. So they want to make it more likely that if you have that higher degree from a U.S. institution, that you'll be selected in the lottery. So let's say that I have a master's degree from Sacred Heart. How would that work? So first I get a shot at the $65,000 in the lottery. And if I don't get selected in that one, then I get to participate in this special $20,000 lottery just for us, just for the high U.S. Masters and Higher graduates. So they changed that a couple years ago, and the numbers have been actually pretty good. They've increased, I think, the chance of being selected if you have a U.S. Master's or higher degree by about 12 to 13%. And I will say anecdotally that I had a huge portion of my Master's or higher U.S. cases selected in the registration than I had for people who did not have a U.S. higher degree. So it really is helpful to have that degree. It just makes it all the more valuable from the lottery perspective. So current availability, there really aren't any, but that's because the registration process has already happened, and I'm going to talk about that now. So just to back up for a second, remember, this is all totally random. It's a random lottery. The only thing that you have control over is your ability to participate in it by understanding the calendar and when to actually make these filings. Because you could have a PhD from Harvard and you're ready to go study to cure cancer. But if you don't understand the H-1B lottery and when to file your H-1B petition, then you have a 0% chance of being selected. Whereas if I have a 2.0 GPA from Steubenville State with my master's program, but I understand the calendar, I have an infinitely better chance of being selected. It has nothing to do with the merits of my case. So you've got to prioritize the things over which you have control, and you have absolute control over mastering this calendar. So by this time, I know you're seeing on October 1st that new code is released. You're like, oh my God, I really, really, really want an H-1B. How do I get one? How do I get one? How soon can I file? Well, they actually improved something for a change under this particular administration. By introducing this new electronic pre-registration program for the H-1B. So to give you a history lesson, back before this year, the earliest you could apply was 6 months before that quota was released, so on April 1st. And the way you would apply is that employers would have to pay attorneys to prepare a full-blown H-1B petition, regardless of whether they know it's going to be selected. They have no choice. They got to file everything as though it's going to be selected. And then employers around the country bombarded USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, with these petitions the first week of April. And and they're all on paper, they're all huge filings, and then they had to do the lottery based on these paper filings. And then you had to wait months sometimes to find out whether or not you've even been selected in the lottery. Because the only way you'd know that you've been selected is either you get a receipt notice in snail mail, or you get the petition physically returned back to the employer. And just think about how costly that is for immigration to have to send all those paper filings that weren't selected in the lottery. And we're talking about over 100,000 filings back to the individual employers. So it was bad on the government's side because of all those administrative costs, but it's bad on the employers and the employee side because of the lack of certainty and the delays in finding out whether or not you've been selected. And the fact that they had to pay for a full-blown petition filing when it might not ultimately even be considered in the lottery because it wasn't selected. So they decided a couple years ago, like, wow, we have this thing called the internet and computers, and maybe we can actually improve this process. So they introduced something called the electronic pre-registration, which actually worked very well this year, and they're going to have it again next year. And the way it works is that there is a registration period in early March. This year is March 1st to 20th. I anticipate it's going to be the same for next year, but it just hasn't been announced yet. So during that 3-week period, the employer can create an account in the USCIS portal. All they have to do is complete very basic information, giving their employer identification number, their name, and then just basic information about you, your passport number, and then they submit that. Or we can do it if they use an attorney. We charge a very small fee. And remember, it's a $10 registration fee. So, I mean, it's far better than some of those other fees. You submit that into their portal. The last week of March, they conduct a lottery based on those electronic registrations. Far easier than going through that manual paper. The computer does it. And then you know by the end of March whether you've been selected. It's great. So the employer knows that if they're going to have to file an H-1B petition, they're only going to have to file it if they know it's going to be considered because it's been selected in the lottery. So then they'll feel more comfortable paying an attorney to do that. So it's less for the employer to buy into at the start, and then it's more likely they're going to want to consummate the entire process. And then it's good for the employer and the employee because you have greater predictability. You'll know, okay, I've been selected in the lottery. Well, do the H-1B. Or if I haven't been selected in the lottery, I'll have to consider one of these alternatives that David's going to talk about in a couple minutes. So really, it provides a lot greater certainty. And once you find out the results that you've been selected, you have a 90-day filing window for the employer to file. And that is advantageous in a couple of different ways for folks. That wasn't the case before. Remember, on April 1st was when they had to file before. Everything that, all of your qualifications, everything is locked in as the time that you file. So on April 1st, if you haven't completed your degree yet, you're going to complete it the next month, you can't be considered. Or if you have a lower degree and you're completing a master's or higher degree in a U.S. institution, but you're not going to complete that until May, you still don't get to benefit from that 20,000 extra lottery because you haven't completed that degree yet. Well, guess what? With this 90-day filing window, so you find out by the end of March whether you've been selected. So that gives you till the end of June to file. So you can wait until after you graduate to file. So in May and June. And by that time, you'll be able to rely on that new degree to qualify you for the position. And you'll be able to rely on that new degree to qualify for that additional 20,000 lottery. So it really makes it a lot better for folks from a calendar perspective, because in the past, I mean, the H-1B lottery, the April 1st to October 1st, did not work or sync so well with the academic calendar, with most people graduating in May and December. So it really is highly beneficial in many different ways. And before I move on to specific examples, because I've been rambling a lot about like abstract stuff, I want to point out one of the handouts that I've provided for dissemination. It's called the Easy Guide to Hiring Foreign Graduates. And that is a one-page guide. It is really your one-stop shop to advocating for yourself in the hiring process, in terms of telling the employer what it takes to hire you, how much it costs, and what they need to do. Because as much as I would love to personally accompany every single one of you to your job interviews, I can't. But what I can do is I can give you that as a piece of me so that you can advocate for yourself, because you got to be your own best advocate. You're the one in there with the employer, and you can leave a copy of that document with the employer with all that information. It's got my contact information on the bottom. They are free to reach out to me at any time, and I will not charge for a consult with them to answer any questions they have. Like I was saying, they have a lot of misconceptions about what they need to advertise, fees that don't exist, things they've heard on the media. Most of the time I've talked to the employers, they end up deciding to sponsor because I've been able to give them the clear, actual truth about the process instead of the innuendos and falsehoods they see online. So it really isn't valuable, but at the end of the day, you need to read this, learn it, love it, laminate it, make copies of it, and leave it with the employer so they know how to reach out to me if they have questions. So let's talk about some examples of.
Oh, David, you did receive a couple questions. I think that last slide, I think sparked some interest. It might be repeating a couple of facts, but I think that that's good because, as you know, this is such a complicated process. So first is, can we apply for the H-1B while doing a master's degree?
Yes, that's a good question. So, well, first of all, if you're going to be completing your master's degree in May, then you can participate in the registration period of March. And if you're selected, you can use that master's degree to qualify both for that additional lottery and for the qualifying for the job. But if you're not close to finishing your master's degree and you're not done by that 90-day window, then you can certainly try an H-1B, but you'd have to rely on your bachelor's degree for that. So let's say I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and I'm doing an MBA in chemical engineering. Well, as long as I have as long as my chemistry degree qualifies me for the job I'm being sponsored for, then I don't need that chemical engineering master's. So that's a great question.
Thank you. And then, is it also possible to apply for H-1B during OPT? And secondly, can I be on H-1B and go for a PhD program?
Well, let me get through I have a couple of examples about how this interacts with OPT in the next couple slides. Now, an H-1B and study a PhD program? Sure, but the caveat is that if you're in H-1B status, you can study, but the primary reason for your being in the United States is to work. So generally, I would say if you're able to maintain full-time H-1B, then maybe you can also do full-time study, but most people in that situation are only going to be able to do it part-time. So sure, you can work during the day and do PhD night courses, but it's going to be tough, but it's allowable as long as the primary reason for your being here is to do your H-1B work.
Great. And one more. I'm graduating in December of 2020, and I have applied for OPT, requested the start date as the end of February. if my employer or sponsor is ready to file H-1B, can I file in 2021 lottery?
Yes, sure. You absolutely can. Yeah, let me get to that's my first example actually right here. So you'll see how that works. So one is you're graduating in May. Well, you're December, but really it's the same example. So if you're graduating in May and your employer has submitted a registration in March of 2021. So again, you have to have an employer who's pretty gung-ho. So they're ready to sponsor you before you even start working for them on OPT, before you even graduate. So this particular student is lucky enough to have an employer on board that sponsored them in March before they graduated and was selected in the lottery. So the employer is then going to use that 90-day filing window to file the H-1B petition for you that will take effect on October 1st. But remember, that's not enough. You got to also have listened to me and got OPT, and you will have that. So the way it interacts is that you'll work on OPT until September 30th, and then you'll wake up on October 1st feeling like a brand new person holding brand new H-1B status. So that is really like your example. So if you're graduating in December, same deal. So if they want to file for you in the March lottery, great. If you're selected, you're just going to work on OPT until October, and then your H-1B is going to take effect on October 1st. So it really is a very similar timeline. Now, example 2 is what most people are going to be encountering. So you graduate in May, and either you didn't have an employer that was gung-ho enough to file for you in March before you graduated, or they did, but you just weren't selected in the lottery. But all is not lost, because remember, you will have listened to me, you will have gone to Pam and filed for OPT, and you'd have OPT. So that's going to get you there and working for an employer, building that relationship. Guess what? Employer is going to want to then file a registration for you in the March lottery of the following year, March of 2022. The student is selected in the lottery. And then during that 90-day filing window, so let's say in April, the employer is going to file for the H-1B that's going to take effect October 1st of 2022. But oh my God, I knew I was missing something. My OPT is only valid for 1 year. I'm not a STEM degree holder, and it's going to expire in June. So it's going to expire in June. My H-1B doesn't take effect until October 1st. So what do I do in July, August, and September? Do I have to stop working? Do I have to go home? Am I going to get deported? Oh my God, is my whole world collapsing around me? No, not at all. Take a deep breath. Don't panic. There's something called H-1B cap gap relief to the rescue. So the way that works is that if you have an employer that files an H-1B petition for you on your behalf on or after April 1st, so within that 90-day filing window, and at the time that petition is filed, your OPT is still valid, then your OPT is automatically going to be extended until September 30th to plug that gap that is caused by the H-1B cap. That's why it's called cap gap relief. So let's go back to this example. So when the employer files your H-1B petition in April, is your OPT still valid? Yes, it doesn't expire until June. So by virtue of that filing, that cap gap is going to be filled. You'll be able to, your OPT is automatically going to be extended until September 30th. And you'll be just like in this example, you'll be able to continue working, and then you wake up feeling like a brand new person on October 1st of 2022, holding shiny brand new H-1B status. So that's the way it works. But remember, it all goes back to OPT. So OPT is important in so many different ways. It's also important in terms of navigating that H-1B calendar and having a stopgap status to keep you working so that you can continue and transition to OPT to H-1B without interruption. All right. So I've been talking a lot about the cap, but I would be remiss in mentioning and not mentioning that there are a lot of different employers that are not subject to the cap. That means that these can file for you whenever the heck they want. They don't have to play that March 1st, October 1st dance. So if they want to hire you in August, they can just file and hire you in August. So it really is important to understand these organizations, and they're laid out on that multi-page handout that I made available that says H-1B cap exemptions and alternatives. So what is the largest category? Universities. So if you are looking at a career in academia, you may never even ever have to encounter the H-1B cap because they're always going to be able to file for you whenever they want. That's also important to understand that it's not necessarily the job that you do that qualifies you for the cap exemption. It's who you are working for. So the identity of the employer. So let's say that I work in IT for Sacred Heart. I don't do anything even remotely academic. I spend all day crawling around under people's desks fixing computers. I'm still exempt from a cap because it's not what I do. It's the fact that I am hired by and I am employed by Sacred Heart, which is a university. That's what makes me cap exempt. Nonprofit organizations that are affiliated with universities. I want to stop for a second to make it clear that a lot of people think that every nonprofit is exempt from the cap. That is not the case. It's only specific types of nonprofits. So if affiliated with the university. So what does that mean? It means there just has to be some sort of formal relationship between that nonprofit organization and a university. So we're talking about research facilities or hospitals, but it can be even broader than that. For example, all public school positions in the state of New York are exempt from the cap. Why is that? Because ultimately the New York State public school system is run by the New York State University Board of Regents. So by virtue of that relationship with the university system, that cap exemption flows down to all those individual school positions. So it's one of those things where it might not be as intuitive up front. So if you think that you might have a job offer from an employer that may be exempt from the cap, just shoot me an email and I'll be able to pretty quickly get back to you and tell you whether or not you have a colorable or legitimate claim to a cap exemption. And I wouldn't charge anything for that. And the last couple things on the slide are pretty basic. I mean, you got think tanks, so nonprofit research organizations, government research organizations. It can be federal, state, or even local. So if the town of Fairfield has a Department of Economic Analysis that wants to hire you, then that could be a government research organization. So really is broader than you might think. Now here's my sad slide. So the H-1B alternatives. You've done everything right. You got OPT. You got an employer on board. They filed a registration for you in the lottery. Your H-1B registration was not selected. Oh my God, is my life in the United States over? Is my career up in flames? Not necessarily. There are a lot of alternatives to the H-1B that while they might not necessarily be as good as the H-1B, they're definitely good enough to hold you over at least maybe until the next year's lottery, okay? And this is all laid out on that multi-page handout I alluded to before that has the cap exemptions and alternatives. So the first category is nationality specific. If you have a passport, so you don't have to be born in these countries, you just have to have a passport from one of these. Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, or Australia, there is a visa category that is very similar to the H-1B for your nationality, and it's never going to be a problem in terms of the cap. So they do have cap numbers, but they're never reached, and they're very similar to the H-1B, and they're excellent alternatives. The L1 categories for people who have prior work experience within a corporate organization outside the U.S., and they're going to work for that same corporate organization inside the U.S. So we're talking about, I worked for the subsidiary in India, now I'm working for the parent company in America. I worked for the affiliate company in France, and now I'm working for another affiliate company in America. So there's got to be a corporate relationship there. The e-visa category is very interesting. The biggest reason is because it is pretty much the only visa category that allows for pure entrepreneurship. The catch is that we have to have, the United States has to have a treaty with your country. So, and again, this is about having a passport from a country, not necessarily being born there. So if you have a passport from any of the countries that are listed on the last page of that multi-page handout, and unfortunately we don't have treaties with some of the larger countries like China, India, Russia, or Brazil, but there are a lot of others that we do have treaties with, then the E1 and E2 visa options are available for you. The E2 visa option is particularly intriguing because it allows for you to get a visa that has no durational maximum. So you can basically have this visa the rest of your life, there's no max, to run a business that you've either purchased or started up based on a substantial investment. So really it allows you to be an entrepreneur. Another way the e-visa works is that you can actually benefit from somebody else's investment as long as they share your nationality. So I think the easiest way to explain this one is through an example. So let's say Rolls-Royce is probably the most British company you can even imagine. So let's say that they decide to set up a facility in Stratford and they invest in some money in getting that started up. I am a UK citizen. I can basically benefit from that UK investment that came into Stratford from Rolls-Royce, and I can work in E2 status for Rolls-Royce as long as I'm working as a manager, supervisor, or an essential skills position. So I don't know if there is any way to refine your job search to find companies that share your nationality, but if there is, then I strongly recommend that because that's sort of a backdoor way of getting work authorization through the E2 category. And then the last two bullets on the slide are pretty intuitive. You can always re-enroll in full-time study, and each level you'll get a new set of OPT and more opportunities for the H-1B lottery. And the last thing is, like, if you are finding yourself shut out and you're feeling like you're losing hope, then you definitely want to make an appointment with an immigration specialist like me or somebody else to make sure that there are no options that we're leaving on the table, because you've invested far too much time and money in your degree here to not explore every single option that is available to you before making that very difficult decision to return home. Because the last thing you want to do is be on your back in your childhood bedroom finding out about this visa category or visa option that you could totally have explored before leaving the US, but now it's too late. You do not want to be in that situation. You owe it to yourself to just send me your resume. We'll have a quick talk or email conversation to make sure that there's nothing that you're missing in order to remain here and put your career back on track in the United States. All right. And there's one other H-1B alternative that deserves its own slide. And it's called the O-1 visa. That's one of extraordinary ability. And this one, you know, you think, oh God, I don't have extraordinary ability, I'm never going to qualify. Well, I'll tell you this, it's not as hard as you might think. And there are a couple of key advantages to the O-1. So the first thing is that it can be filed up to a year before the start date. So if you're nervous about the H-1B lottery, and you don't want to put your hands in, you don't want to risk having being at the whim of being selected in the lottery, then you can file this up to a year in advance, maybe even have an approval before the H-1B lottery even takes place. So you already have this 3 years of employment authorization, and you don't even have to worry about risking it in the H-1B lottery. It's great in terms of peace of mind. And look at that third bullet. A key advantage is that you can actually pay the filing fees and legal fees for this. So there's no similar requirement like there is for the H-1B category where the employer has to pay. You can pay this. So it's really great. So if you, for peace of mind, if you want to get this in, and also if you don't get selected in the H-1B lottery, then you can do an O-1 that way. So you can either do it, you can do it on either side of the lottery depending on the results, or if you want to avoid that in the first place. So it's got to be at the small percentage of the top of your field. Well, guess what? Defining your field is a very strategic consideration. You know, you could say, I'm at the top of my field, a biologist. Well, that's not a good way to define your field because that's got a huge denominator. The larger the field, the harder it is to show that you race to the top of it. We can strategically define your field and make it as narrow as possible so that magically you are at the very top of that narrowly defined field. It is really a key consideration. So how do I qualify for the O-1? And this is all laid out on one of my handouts. I think it's the blue handout. So you can either have a major international award like Nobel Prize. I don't know if anybody on this call has Nobel Prize yet, but once you do, it's a pretty easy case. Or if you don't, if you're mortal, then you meet at least 3 of 8 specific criteria that are laid out on this slide. So none of these criteria are going to be particularly surprising to you. You know, if you have a really high salary, if you have publications about you in major media, if you've done made a lot of contributions, authored a lot of things, those are going to really help. So if you have to meet at least 3 of these, but you can't rest on your laurels. Just be like, okay, I checked 3 boxes, I'm done. No. They have to go one step further. There's something called the final merits analysis. So getting 3 gets you through the door to being considered, but what gets you to the finish line is a really good story that hopefully you'll have an attorney who's got experience working with these is able to tell you. Because for people in the scientific field or math field, it's really hard for you guys to understand how to put these cases together because you're used to talking to each other in the field using jargon all the time. When you file one of these petitions, it is not going to be reviewed by a colleague of yours in the math department. It's going to be reviewed by a layperson at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services who may not even have a college degree. And you have to have the skill set of an attorney to make it understandable to them while at the same time not diminishing your accomplishments. And that is a very particular skill set. And you're going to need to find somebody who has experience in that area because you got to make it understandable because if you're just throwing jargon at them, they're going to throw up their hands and say, forget about it. You know, make it relatable and make sure that that they understand the importance of your work. So really, it's not just about meeting these 3. Once you get through the 3, you got to tell a good story, and that's what gets you across to the finish line. But the O-1 is an excellent alternative to anybody who may qualify. And if you think you might qualify for the O-1 or any of these other categories I'm about to talk about, just shoot me a copy of your resume, your CV, and we will go into great detail about what your prospects are, even giving you a percentage estimate about your chance of success, and we don't charge for that kind of stuff. So please don't be shy to try to reach out to me on this. And then the last part of the presentation, I'm going to conclude with the green card process, because I know that's what everybody wants. But before I proceed to that, I wanted to make sure that there were no questions I had to answer about some of these alternatives or any leftover H-1B questions.
We had one more leftover H-1B question, and it was, we had a student who went from their bachelor's directly to their master's, and they were just wondering if they need work experience to apply for the H-1B.
No, the work experience is irrelevant for the H-1B. It's all based on academic requirements for the position. So as long as the job requires at least a bachelor's degree in a specific specialty, it doesn't matter if you have 55 years of work experience. All they care about is that you have a degree or at least the equivalent of the degree based on work experience. So that's All right, so let's talk about the pièce de résistance, the green card, what everybody wants. So again, to harken back to my second slide, only so many ways to obtain it. One of my handouts goes over the family relationships. So that's pretty intuitive. You're here at Sacred Heart, you're in a study group, you meet the man or woman of your dreams, and that person just so happens to be a US citizen. You get married, you file the paperwork. It's a lot of paperwork, it's complicated paperwork, but this pathway to a green card is pretty straightforward. You can have the green card in about a year, and then you can go on living your life in marital bliss. Some family relationships you think are more beneficial than they actually are. So you're probably like, my brother's a US citizen, I'm all set, I'm gonna log off right now. No, don't, because your brother being a US citizen is not gonna really give you any great benefit. You are looking at about a 15 to 20 year wait for a green card. And remember, you can't just crack your knuckles and sit back and wait for the process to go through, because look at my last bullet. You've got to maintain a non-immigrant status for throughout that period. So do you have a way to remain here for 15 years while that goes through? If you're from the Philippines, it's 35 or 40 years. So it really is not that useful. And you will find, especially if you have a degree from a US institution like Sacred Heart, then there are far better and faster options based on employment and special skills, which we'll spend the rest of our presentation talking about. The next is diversity visa lottery. I'm not going to spend much time on that other than to say that I think that the lottery is open right now. If you're from one of the countries that is eligible to participate in the visa lottery, and spoiler alert, it's not going to be China or India. It's got to be countries that we traditionally don't have very high patterns of immigration from. So we're talking about like Africa, Western Europe, those types of things. You can go ahead and throw your hat in the lottery. It's not going to impact your F1 status just because of the remoteness of the chance of being selected. I mean, it's like any other lottery. There were about 50 million, I think there were 10 million applicants last year for 50,000 slots. So you're not going to want to put all your eggs in that basket, but really at least one or two people contact me every year who've been selected in the lottery. And it's certainly not something that'll hurt you. Go ahead and participate in it and maybe you get selected, but make sure that you have other options available. And then we have the employment and special skills, which I'll spend the rest of my time on. There are three categories. So they're preference categories. So theoretically, the first has the lowest wait time and the third has a longer wait time. The reality is that unless you're born in China or India, right now there are almost no wait times for any of these categories, even the third preference category. So EB1 is first preference. So we really, really, really want you guys. So we're talking about extraordinary ability, outstanding professors and researchers, multinational managers or executives. Those guys all get the fast track, green card, highest priority. EB2, we really want you, not as much as EB1. So we're talking about people with advanced degrees, so a master's degree, if you're working in a job that requires at least a master's, or a bachelor's degree with 5 years of experience, that qualifies as an advanced degree position, puts you in the second preference category. Exceptional ability in the national interest. We'll talk about that category in a second. That's also in the second preference category. And then EB3s for the rest of us who are not as exceptional. If you just have a job requiring a bachelor's degree or a job that requires at least 2 years of experience, then that's going to get you in the EB3 category. But again, for all these things, you have to maintain your non-immigrant status throughout. You can't just crack your knuckles, put your feet up on the desk, and say, I got the green card process going, I'm good to go. So that brings me to this slide. Remember, I told you about the 6-year maximum, and I said there were ways to extend it beyond the 6 years if it's based on a green card process. Here we are. It's got to be an employment-based green card process. So again, to harken back to your brother's or your sister's petition for you, that's not going to allow you to extend your H-1B beyond 6 years. It's got to be an employment-based process. So how do I extend it beyond 6 years? Well, the first is pretty intuitive. It's 6 years inside the US. So anytime that I'm outside the US during that period, I can recapture it. So let's say I'm a professor. Every year during my 6 years, I spend 2 months in the summer back home. Well, 2 months times 6 years is 12 months. That's an entire year I can recapture, tack on to the end, and essentially get myself the 7th year of H-1B. The second is if I have an employment-based green card process that's been pending for at least a year, then I can extend my H-1B in 1 year increments. So again, this is all about timing. So you're never stopping with this timing, with this planning. You got to think 3 steps ahead. You don't want to be in your 6th year and only then start your green card process, because you're not going to have a green card process that's been pending at least a year that's going to allow you to extend your green card, your H-1B. It's just not going to happen. So when should you start thinking about the green card process and talking to the employer about it? I usually recommend it after you get your first extension of the H-1B. So after that 3-year period and you get that 3-year extension, that's a good reminder to start talking to the employer about the H-1B. And then the last one is for folks mostly from China or India who've completed all the steps. You've gone through and you've gotten what's called an approved I-140 petition, which is the immigrant petition that's filed by either you or the employer. But you just can't file that last green card step because there are no quota numbers available because I'm having to wait 7, 8, 9 years because I'm from India and we only have so many quota numbers available every year. Then I can keep extending it in 3-year increments. So that's how you do it. It's got to be based on an employment-based process. Don't wait until the last minute to start that process. So I'm gonna finish up by talking about these various categories. So you got the EB1A. So that's somebody who's got extraordinary ability. So I'm in the first preference category. So no wait time, pretty much. Look at that first bullet. That's why it's so popular. Is it's self-sponsored. You don't have to have an employer. You don't have to have a job offer even. You just have to show that you are going to work in your field. Again, a small percentage at the top of your field. These are all going to be very similar to what I talked about with the O1. And it's going to be same thing, major international awards. So do you have a Nobel Prize, an Oscar, or Grammy, something like that, or at least 3 of the following, and they're all going to be very similar to the O1. Again, meaning 3 isn't enough. You got to be able to tell a good story and make it relatable to the immigration officer who's a layperson. And again, if you think you might qualify, shoot me an email. We'll take a look. EB1B. So this is also the first preference, but it's an outstanding professor or researcher. The standard here is a little bit lower than the EB1A because it's employer sponsored. So you're going to have that backstop of a university or research institution that's filing this petition for you. You've got to be working in a permanent position. That's not to say that it can't be a position that's under contract. So if you are on a year-to-year contract, but that contract is renewed every year and the expectation that it's going to be renewed every single year, then that qualifies for a permanent position. You got to have at least 3 years of teaching and research experience. But guess what? You can amass that experience even before you graduate. So it doesn't mean that you have to wait until you've been a professor or a researcher after your PhD for 3 years. You can use stuff that you did during your PhD program. So I've done plenty of these cases for first-year professors that have gotten approved. And look, there's only 2 of the factors. You only have to meet 2 of these factors. So instead of 3 from the previous one, you got 2. They're all very similar, and you'll see that they look very familiar and they bleed back and forth between different categories. Again, 2 is to get you through to the door, but to get to the finish line, it's going to be the same type of story. Shoot me an email with your CV if you think you might qualify, and we'll take a look. EB2. So now we're into the second preference category, the national interest waiver. So for anybody who's not from China or India, there's no wait time in this category. So if you have a choice between EB1 and EB2, well, the EB2 is a lower standard and you don't really have any wait time. So many people will choose to just subject themselves to a lower standard and get the EB2 approval. So again, this is a very attractive category because it's, again, self-sponsored, no job offer required, no employer involved. You just have to show that you're going to work in the national interest in your field. So the standard is a little bit lower. So the EB1 was extraordinary ability. This is exceptional ability, meaning it's got to be expertise significantly above that ordinarily encountered. Now, what will jump off at you is the factors here are a lot easier to satisfy than the EB1. So look at the first one, a degree relating to your area of exceptional ability. Well, almost everybody's going to have that, especially if you're graduating right now. Membership in a professional association. You can actually pay to join an association and satisfy that factor. So that's 2 factors right off the bat. But again, it goes back to what I was saying before, is this just gets you through the door. What gets you to the finish line is telling that coherent and persuasive story about why the work you're doing is in the national interest and why it behooves the government of the United States to allow you to short circuit the ordinary green card process to get closer to the finish line because of the importance of the work that you're doing. So it's really important to have somebody who can tell those stories. But, again, it's almost no wait time for the EB2 national interest waiver. If you think you're interested and you might qualify, shoot me an email. And then the last is, I'd say probably 85 to 90% of people end up doing this way to get the green card. It's the perm labor certification. And there's no shame in it. It's a pretty easy process. It's very highly regimented, but it requires, and this is where employers get confused, this is the process that requires them to advertise for your position to show that there are no U.S. workers. So what category is this going to be falling under? Well, it depends on what the requirements of the position are. So if the job requires a master's degree or it requires a bachelor's degree and at least 5 years of experience, then you're in the second preference category. No wait times at all except for China and India. If you're only requiring a bachelor's degree or at least 2 years of experience, you're in EB3. Guess what? no wait times at all, except for China and India right now. So really, there's not any great advantage. It depends on the requirements for the position, not your own personal background. So if I have a master's degree, but the job that I'm applying for or being sponsored for only requires a bachelor's degree, then I'm going to be in the EB3 category, even though I could theoretically apply for a job that would be EB2 caliber if it required a master's. It's employer sponsored. It's a permanent position, full-time. And again, they just need to go through the motions and do these stupid advertising steps. And it really isn't that big of a deal because the advertising steps that they make the employer go through come like they're right out of the 1950s from Leave It to Beaver. I mean, they make you put an ad in 2 Sunday editions of the newspaper. Who actually looks in the Sunday paper for job opportunities anymore? But it actually works to your benefit because the fewer people apply, the easier it is for you to squeak through that test and go on to the greener pastures of the green card. Now, I will mention that if there's a U.S. worker who meets the minimum requirements, then you got to start over again. The reality is that, number one, because of how these positions are defined, and number two, how they're advertised, there are very few times when that's going to be an issue because you're going to have almost nobody apply. And even if there are people who apply, almost nobody's going to meet the requirements for the position. And it's worth mentioning that for folks who aren't comfortable enough or who don't have the universities sponsoring them for the outstanding professors or researchers in that EB1 category, if you're not quite at that level yet, you can do a perm and it's an actual easier standard as long as you have some teaching duties in your position. If you're sponsored by an institute of higher education, they can just go ahead and say you're more qualified than anybody else. So it's not the minimally qualified standard, it's that we just like you more, and that allows them to go through to the finish line. So it's actually a much easier standard. So I'll close with this. I mean, choosing an attorney, I mean, you understand how difficult this process is these days. This administration's made it exponentially more difficult. It's going to take years to undo some of the damage that they've done. So this is not going away anytime soon. It's really important for you to have somebody that you work with who knows this stuff and who is very knowledgeable and very experienced. What is not relevant is where the person is located. So immigration law is federal. The immigration law in Connecticut is the same as the immigration law in Florida, in California, and in Virginia. So really everything is done nowadays, especially since people are not meeting in person much anymore, by Zoom, by email, by phone, by cloud. So really the location of somebody is not important. What is important is getting somebody who actually can help you, because if the employer cheaps out or does it themselves and it gets denied, well, you know, they're out some money, but you know, ultimately it's your life and your career and you are the one who suffers. So don't hesitate to speak up and make sure that they get the right person. I'm certainly here as a resource, but I don't care if you don't use me, that's fine. Just make sure that you use somebody who actually does know what they're doing, because we don't want you guys to have to leave the country because you didn't get the right help. I want to make sure that you get the right help. It's a passion of mine. I want smart people to stay in the United States to continue growing our economy and making us the envy of the world. So I'm going to leave my information here. Feel free to reach out to me anytime, by email or phone. I'm going to stop and take some questions if anybody has them. But you know, during these in-person things, when I'm on campus, I have a long line of people come up and ask me questions about their cases. If you're not feeling comfortable asking about your case in front of other people, feel free to reach out to me. I'll set up a time where we can talk in private on phone or Zoom or even by email. So thanks so much.
First of all,
Thank you so
David.
much.
We wanted to just take a moment and thank you for sharing that wealth of knowledge. You are truly an expert in your field and have been an advocate for our international students for so many years. So we do appreciate everything that you do. We did have additional questions come through.
Fire away.
So I'm going to actually work my way backwards because this one was specific about the green card. The student had heard that when you apply for the green card lottery, your chances of getting an H-1 visa, OPT, or anything else will actually lessen, right? Anything that will give them residency in the U.S. will be lower. Is that true?
No, I don't know where you're reading that from. It has absolutely no relationship to any of these other processes. If you're from a country that can participate in the diversity lottery, go ahead and do it. There's no harm in doing it. It's not going to affect your ability to keep your F1 status. It's not going to hamper your ability to get future green card or H-1B sponsorship.
That's great. Thank you. And I love Carolina's question. Could you talk a bit about what happened to the number of employment visas since they were not all used for family visas during COVID?
Yeah, so what they've done is that they've reallocated some of those visas. The way that the rules are, the structure is that those actually, the unused visas go to employment-based categories. So for that reason, a lot of us were very busy last month in October because the dates for filing jumped many years. So people who are from India who had been waiting 10, 15 years to file, all of a sudden October was the month they could file. So we had a huge amount of filings because they were recapturing and repurposing those visas for employment-based categories. So that's what they've been used for. It's been pretty good in terms of that. But we still need to have some really wholesale reform on the number of visas that are available in these annual green card quotas, because it hasn't changed since 1990, and the world's changed a little bit since then.
Thank you for that. So that, I believe I touched on all the questions that are in the chat box. Students, I encourage you, if you do have specific questions, please feel free to unmute and ask now. Again, if you're not comfortable, David is available via email. I did put his email in the chat box as well, in case that helps. When
There's
I get
one more question.
Yeah, go ahead, Helen. You want to jump in?
When I get the OPT, can I change the place I work for, or do I have to stay with them until my OPT is expired?
No, that's a good question also. I mean, you can change to another job on OPT as long as it's related to your field of study, but you got to keep your International Students Office updated, and you got to go, if you're updating, if you're going to be doing it in the CVIS portal, you got to update every time in the database when you change employers. But it's perfectly allowable. You just need to make sure that it's properly reported.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Does anyone else have any questions? You guys have been a very attentive audience, and thank you for asking such tremendous questions. It brought a lot of value to the conversation, so I appreciate that you all actively participated today. So I'm going to first stop the recording,